Okay, grade 9. Here we are with our lesson number 4 of evolution unit, and we're going to be talking about what natural selection is today. We'll be talking about the lesson of it today, and the next class you'll be doing a virtual lab about it. And Mr. Bite and I have to decide yet if we're going to grade it. So for today we're talking about natural selection, lesson number 4. So first things first, by the end of today's lesson, you will have this big idea. You should already have this big idea kind of figured out mostly, but you may want to kind of cement your ideas with today's lessons. The first big idea is, how are multiple pieces and types of evidence used to form a scientific theory? So the last 2 classes we focused on 6 different kinds of evidence for evolution, so use that information to write out your first big idea in your notebook. You'll have to submit your big ideas in your notebook as part of your homework for today's lesson, as well as your notes from today. So make sure you have both those things done, please. Okay, so here's today's template. We have a 2-pager, a space where before Darwin, just writing some text. Natural selection, what is it? There's a big diagram to draw here. So we have a big amount of space. The 4 principles and an example you will be analyzing. You'll be doing a drawing here of your own design and description here. So give yourself a decent amount of space to do this. Pause the video and draw your template, please. Okay, so now you have your template done. Let's talk about who came before Darwin. So Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace contributed big things to the theory of the field of evolutionary biology. Specifically, their idea that evolution occurs by natural selection. That mechanism of natural selection was their major contribution. But before them, several different scientists and even one economist had to come up with specific things that helped build this framework of knowledge within which Darwin and Wallace could then postulate natural selection. Without these 4 men and their ideas before them, this wouldn't have worked. Okay, so remember, at the time period when this was all happening, everyone believed, at least in Europe anyway, in the 7-day creation story from the Bible, that the earth was about 3,000 years old based on the timeline from the Bible, and that if it was here, it's because God put it here, and it wouldn't go extinct because God made a perfect world. So in order to get to the point where with Darwin and Wallace's natural selection theory, we had to have some other things kind of figured out first. So here we have Lamarck. Lamarck was a French scientist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he figured out that organisms are able to adapt to their environment. So this connection between the organism and the environment, that was something that Lamarck came up with. And that was a really important thing for evolution to actually make sense later on. And then we have Cuvier here, another French scientist, Georges Cuvier, and he figured out that organisms change over time. The idea that an organism isn't a certain way when it was first made or created and then just stays that way. He looked at lots of different fossils. He was a geologist, and he found lots of different fossils and saw that organisms can change, that things that are one way maybe can change over long periods of time. So that was a big part of this idea too, that organisms can change and not just this one thing that God created and that's the way it stayed. And then we have Charles Lyell. He was English, I believe. And he said that the earth is billions of years old. So he analyzed different geological changes. He also studied geology and geologic processes, how rocks are changing, all that kind of stuff, erosion patterns, these different kinds of things. And he realized that for things to make sense the way he's seeing these patterns, the earth can't be 3,000 years old. It has to be billions of years old. And that gives a time frame in which natural selection can actually work. And the last one is Thomas Malthus, and he's a very famous English economist, and he had the idea of overproduction. This idea that there's too many individuals then can survive. So in his example, he was actually talking about humans. There's too many humans on Earth that can survive. There's not enough agricultural food, not enough energy, not enough resources, so some people have to die. But it's a competition between people for reasons they need to survive, and that idea applies just as well to organisms, plants, animals, all different organisms, where there's too many of them born who can survive in the environment, and they need to compete, which is important. It's a key idea in ecology too. If you think back to our population graphs in ecology, when we reach the carrying capacity, that's kind of what Malthus is getting at here, the idea that there's a carrying capacity for the earth, for people, based on limiting factors like food sources, like medicine, like energy supply, like shelter, all those kinds of things. Okay, so these four gentlemen came before Darwin. There were other scientists too. In fact, Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, also had ideas about evolution, but these are the four main important ideas that allowed Darwin and Wallace to come up with the idea of natural selection. Okay, so here we have Darwin and Wallace back again. And so the idea of evolution was not their idea. It was an old idea that Darwin's grandfather even worked on. But what they contributed was this theory of evolution by natural selection. Natural selection, the mechanism by which this theory could work, was what they came up with. And that was a huge deal. All of a sudden, all this idea of organisms evolving, it had a logical mechanism with evidence. It could make sense. It could be valid. And that's why they were then willing and able to kind of share it without being ridiculed too much in their group, in society in general. Okay, so then if that's a big deal that they proposed was natural selection, what is natural selection? Well, natural selection is a process. It's a process by which organisms who are better adapted to their environment, they're more likely to survive and pass on their traits, their offspring. And that leads to changes in the traits of the population over many generations. This is not a short-term thing. This is on the scale of the entire population, not one or two individuals, and it takes a very long time. So this is a drawing I want you to draw. I know it's a big one, but it's an important one to help illustrate this. So if we look at this example here, we have two light-colored moths, and they lay many, many eggs. And those eggs develop into caterpillars, and the caterpillars then become adults. So that's the reproduction, the DNA passing from the parent to the offspring. In all these babies that became moths, we have some variation. Most of them are light-colored, but there are some dark-colored. Maybe it's a mutation in their DNA. They're a little bit different than other ones, and they have a darker color. There's some competition. In this case, it's predation. The predators are going to hunt the moths, and they're more likely to pick up a white moth than a brown moth, just because they can see it more easily. So that means there's a slightly larger number of brown moths are going to survive and reproduce, and then when they reproduce, they're going to pass on the dark brown trait to their offspring. So over time, we get this darker brown moth population. It's much more dark brown than light brown, went from this kind of population to this population, but in many, many generations, because of the selection pressure, because the predators are more likely to take out the light moths than the dark moths. Continue to draw this. Please use color for the light and dark to show it blends into the environment, okay? A key component of this whole idea of natural selection is the idea of adaptation, which was not Darwin's idea, it was Lamarck's idea. So what does the word adaptation mean to you? I'm sure you've heard a lot of it about it outside of the context of science. In science, in biology, what does it mean to adapt? Pause and think about this for a second. So adaptation is a key idea of connecting the connection between the environment and the individual. If an individual is adapted to its environment, that means it is able to survive in its environment for some reason. There's some sort of trait that it has that allows it to better survive in its particular environment. So of these different moths here in my population, which moths are better adapted and why? Well, in this case, the moths better adapted are going to be the dark colored ones. And they're better adapted because they camouflage better, they blend in with their environment. Whereas the light colored ones are not well adapted. Now, if they move to a different tree, maybe a tree with really light colored bark like a birch tree, then maybe the light ones would be better adapted and the dark ones would be not as well adapted. So it's all based on the environment. Okay, so let's look at another example. Here, this crazy creature, this is a star-nosed mole, which I think is so ugly, it's actually kind of cute. So if you look here, the eyes are right up here, they're very tiny, and this big part here is its nose. So take a look at it and think about what kind of adaptations are obvious in star-nosed mole. How would those traits have evolved? And what is the role of descent in evolution? So descent is about passing on your DNA. So pause the video, think for a minute, talk to a classmate if you have them on WhatsApp or FaceTime or Zoom or something, and think about this. Okay, so hopefully you came up with some ideas that the adaptations that are obvious here is we have this really sensitive big nose to help sense in the dark, because moles live underground, that's their environment, and it's dark, they can't see anything, so they don't really have big eyes, so they have much bigger nose. They also have giant whiskers here, also to help it sense in the dark. You should also notice the claws are very large, very adapted for digging underground. So how would those traits come to be? Well, in the original star-nosed mole population, maybe some moles had smaller claws, some had bigger claws, some had a bigger nose, a smaller nose. And then the ones that had the bigger nose or the bigger claws were more likely to be successful. They could dig more tunnels, they could find prey like insects to eat underground quicker, get more worms, they could survive better, and then they're able to reproduce more because they have more energy. So descent in evolution is the idea that it's the mole's DNA that is passing on these traits. So the parents of this mole would have probably had very similar traits, bigger nose, bigger claws, bigger whiskers. Doesn't mean they're exactly the same, but they definitely were similar. And as time goes on, it's going to pass on those traits to its offspring. And those organisms who are more successful, they're fitter, they have more food energy because they have more food, because they're better adapted, they're going to have more babies and pass on those traits more often. Which leads me to the 4 principles of natural selection. So when you're talking about any example of natural selection, it's really important you think of these 4 principles. I say this to all my students all through high school, right to my grade 12 biology students, because it's easy to forget and miss one part of this and then not get a complete answer. So always force yourself to analyze all 4 components of natural selection. And those 4 principles are variation, overproduction, adaptation, and descent with modification. Okay, so what do these mean? Variation means there's variation in the population. Whatever trait you're looking at, there's differences between it. So let's look at a class of our students. There's variation in our students in hair color or eye color, height, foot size, all those things. There's variation in the population of humans, of students at RAS. Overproduction would be in a student's competition. So let's say there's a population of fish in the ocean, and there's only so many smaller fish they can eat. They're going to compete, and the ones who can't get access to food for whatever reason, they're not going to survive. Adaptation. If you look at the fish again, the fish who are better swimmers can turn faster, can see better, are going to have an advantage to catch prey more easily, and they're more likely to survive because they're better adapted to their environment. In this case, it's catching their prey. And then descent modification. The fish who are more likely to survive and do better are also probably going to pass on their genes and lay more eggs and then pass on their genes to the next generation. So more fish the next generation are likely to have their traits. Faster swimmers, better eyesight, whatever it happens to be. So a classic example to think about this, and Lamarck talked about this, is the neck of a giraffe. So giraffes have a very long neck, and it helps them reach the top of the trees and get lots of food to eat. So I want you to pause the video and outline the 4 parts here for the giraffe. Again, feel free to work with somebody else and try and brainstorm together. What are the 4 principles for a giraffe? Okay, so here are my answers. So variation in the original giraffe population, or the current giraffe population, there is variation. Some giraffes had longer necks, some giraffes had shorter necks. There's variation in neck length. Not everyone has exactly the same neck. Overproduction. There's more giraffes who are born in a certain year or in general population than can survive. There's competition for food. And in this case, the competition for resource is the food at the top of the trees or food anywhere. Between all the giraffes. There's not enough food to keep all of them alive. Adaptation. The environment of the giraffes has these tall trees and competition for food with other organisms, not just giraffes. So giraffes who can reach the leaves at the top of the tree are going to have access to more foods, or better adapted to each food sources in their environment. And then descent modification, the giraffes who have longer necks they're more likely to survive and pass on their traits to their offspring. And their offspring could have a variety of neck lengths. Maybe one giraffe a really long neck and its offspring has 4 offspring. One has a super crazy long neck, one has a little bit shorter than its parents, but the two are exact same as their parents. Some variation as well in the offspring. So some of those may have even longer necks and are likely to pass that trait on to their offspring. Okay, so let's practice this with some other traits here. So here we have 3 other traits. We have the ossicones of a giraffe, up here is called the ossicones, the size of the ears on an elephant, and the long tongue of an anteater. I want you to pause, talk to somebody else about how did those traits evolve. Okay, so if all of these traits would have to evolve from some sort of the same 4 principles. So let's do ear size. In the elephant population, there's a variety, there's variation in ear size. Some have really big ears, some have smaller ears, they have different size ears. The adaptation part is the ears have to help the elephant survive. In the case of elephants, ears actually help keep them cool in the hot environment they live in, both by flapping their ears to cool them down, and because the ears are so thin and they're full of blood vessels, the elephant can pump its blood from its body into its ears, and the heat is able to leave the ear, because it's such a thin tissue, it's able to move the heat to the air really easily, and then it takes that cooler air from the ear, brings it back into the body, and cools in the bigger part of the body. It's too thick to cool down easily, and it keeps pumping the air through that way. So that's adaptation, variation, overproduction. There's too many elephants who can survive. So elephants who are too hot are maybe going to need more water to cool down than elephants who are able to cool themselves down better. And if water is a limiting factor in their environment, those elephants that are able to cool themselves off better are more likely to survive. And as a modification, those elephants who have bigger ears and are slightly advantaged and able to survive more likely, they're probably going to pass on that trait to their offspring when they're born, are going to have bigger ears. And it can use for multiple generations. The same thing is going to be happening for the other 2. So in the anteater, it has variation in tongue length, adaptation. Ants with longer tongues are able to put their tongue further into ant hills, and take more ants out and get more energy. If they have more energy, they can compete better and get more food. That's the connection with that's overproduction. It's competition for food between the anteaters. And as a modification, the anteaters who have more food are better likely to survive, pass on their traits to their offspring. These ones are really interesting. I wonder if we got this right. Ossicones are used by giraffes to fight. And you can look up a YouTube video of this. I recommend you do it. Giraffes fighting, it's really cool. So they actually will stand there and swing their necks down and hit it with these bony ossicones. The bones will hit each other, and they will hit their stomachs. And so 2 males will line up side by side and they'll fight. You really should look up a YouTube video, it's really crazy. And they'll hit each other in the stomach, and then the one that gives up first or is killed or is injured is not going to mate, and the one who is successful is going to be able to mate. So the females will only mate with the male who's the strongest, because he won the fight. So if you think about it, there's going to be a variety in the size and hardness of ossicones of male giraffes. The ones who the overproduction is not enough females with all the males, so the females are being choosy, only mating with males who have strong ossicones who win the fights. So the ones who are able to fight and win because they have stronger, harder ossicones that can injure their opponent more quickly are going to pass on their traits, their offspring, by mating with the females. Okay, the last example here that you're going to figure out is for sea lions. Okay, so this is one you're going to write up for yourself, and I'm going to give you feedback on Schoology, and I recommend you work with somebody else. So this is a sea lion, and this is in the Galapagos Island. Here's the situation. The sea lions in the Galapagos, they have suddenly lost their main food source. So the ocean temperature changed, and the currents changed, and the anchovies, all these small fish they normally eat, are gone. The population left the islands, and the sea lions have lost that food source. The only food source left for the sea lions is a crab, a very small crab that lives on the seafloor, but is about 100 feet below the surface. 100 feet in meters, I'll have to look it up and post it for you guys, I can't remember. Or you can convert it yourselves. So what you need to do is figure out what traits in the sea lion could be adaptive and how the population would change over time. So how is the sea lion going to change over time based on this change in its environment? I want you to write a description of how it will change and draw one possible outcome. I recommend you do this with a classmate, brainstorm somebody else, try and figure this out. To give you a bit of a hint, here is a sea lion. You can see really carefully, notice its jaw and its shape, notice its tooth shape. There are other traits as well, but that's the only hint I'm going to give you. Okay, so take a look. You can think about at least 3 or 4 different traits that may be adaptive and how they would change based on this environment change. Okay, that's the end of today's lesson. The other thing you have to do is now you have enough information to talk about how science is a collaborative, cumulative process. So how does science build over time and how do scientists work together? So your homework is to complete your notebook lesson from today, which includes the Save the Sea Lions write-up and also the 2 big ideas. So you have 2 big ideas page that needs to be uploaded to Schoology as well as your notes, which includes your Save the Sea Lions work. Next class, you'll be doing an online simulation lab about natural selection. Okay, guys, that's it. I hope everyone's staying home and staying safe and that you are having a good day. As always, any questions, please feel free to email me.